Okay, I think they're ready for me to start, except I don't have my slides up. Brian, can you put my slides up? There we go. All right, wonderful. Okay. Well, as I generally will start, I think most everyone here has been coming throughout the quarter, and I appreciate you being with us. If by chance you're visiting or if this is your first class, we've been talking about the restoration movement this quarter. We are really coming down the home stretch here. We have 3 classes left. Today, we're right on the doorstep, really, of a major division, and we're going to really get up to that today, just right on the edge of it. And then next week, John's going to talk about the Christian colleges and the impact they had on the restoration movement. And then the last week, I'm going to try to cram probably about 3 weeks of stuff into that last lesson, because I want to talk about not only the actual division between the disciples of Christ, the Christian church, and the churches of Christ, which was observed by the United States Census in 1906. Is 06 or 07? 06? Yeah, 06. But then also talk about kind of where the movement is today. We'll sort of do a giant leap from the early 1900s until into the 2000s, and sort of maybe where we are today and what it looks like in the future. And it's interesting because, sometimes people pose the question, if the founding fathers were alive today, what would they think of the country that they founded? And everybody has their opinion. Well, I sometimes think, if these characters that we're talking about that were so influential in the restoration movement were alive today, what would they think of where the church is? The thoughts I have are colorful. I don't think they would particularly like a lot of the things that we have gotten into, but nevertheless, that's for a couple of weeks from now. Where I want to start today, do you know who this lady is? Anybody? All right, her name is Anna Jarvis. Now, does that mean anything to you? No? Anybody? Anna Jarvis is responsible for Mother's Day. Anna Jarvis, her mother died in 1905. And I bring this up not only because it's Mother's Day, but we're talking about history, and so I thought, well, why not? We'll just take a little side road here and talk about where Mother's Day came from. So she lobbied President Wilson for years, and finally in 1914, he established Mother's Day as a national day in this country. Now, here's the interesting part. It wasn't very long at all before she regretted her actions, and by 1923, she lobbied the president to rescind there being a Mother's Day because it had become so commercialized by Hallmark and the chocolate companies. She was so adamant to get rid of it that in 1925 she was arrested protesting a fundraising event for war mothers who were selling carnations. So great turnabout. But anyway, happy Mother's Day, and just enjoy that little tidbit. Okay, so getting into what we're going to talk about today. Now, I'm going to go, since it's been a few weeks, I'm going to go back and re-till some ground with some information that I'm sure you have forgotten. But the reason I want to recover it is because it all sort of plays together in coming to the conflict that I'm going to talk about at the end of class. So if you remember a few weeks ago, I talked about the beginning of the Missionary Society, which really had come about with this movement that Alexander Campbell started, really, to organize the brotherhood to be more effective on the whole than congregations acting individually. And so the first organization was the American Christian Bible Society, which organized in Cincinnati early on in 1845. Well, in 1849, they had a meeting of the Bible Society and decided they wanted to establish a missionary society to promote the preaching of the gospel in destitute places throughout the world. Now, the intent was good, obviously, to have a most effective way of mission work. Problem is, when you get these societies that have a hierarchy, president and officers and secretaries and so forth, they sort of take on a life of their own. And that's exactly what happened. The society had annual delegates, life members, and life directors, and these life memberships, you got those, you basically purchased them by donating money. Well, there was immediately opposition to it, and then after the Civil War, opposition became so widespread that ultimately the church was divided. Now, the Missionary Society was not the only reason. We're going to talk about another major reason, but there were a number of things that were problematic. Really, what we're going to talk about are the symptoms of the real problem. But anyway, Tolbert Fanning stated in the Gospel Advocate that the Church of God is the only divinely authorized missionary, Bible, Sunday school, and temperance society, the only institution in which the Heavenly Father will be honored, and through no other agency can a man glorify his Maker. It was wrong to do the work of the church through merely human agencies. Then we come to the Civil War. Now, John did a fantastic job of talking about the impact of the war on the Restoration movement. And I want to sort of cover that again briefly and maybe add a couple of tidbits that significantly played into what was going on. The Civil War, it's often described as that war that pitted brother against brother, and that was one of the great tragedies of it. But maybe a greater tragedy is that it pitted Christian brother against brother. And that was a real source of pain for these Restoration leaders. Except for Walter Scott, all of the early Restoration leaders had been pacifists. Alexander Campbell, Benjamin Franklin. Now, Benjamin Franklin, by the way, was the grandnephew of the founding father, Benjamin Franklin, but it is a different Benjamin Franklin. J.W. Garvey, Moses Lard, and Lard is an interesting character. We haven't really had time to talk about him. He was actually born in Bedford County, but his father moved the family to Missouri. His father got smallpox and died, and so Lard grew up very poor and was uneducated, but had a natural gift for writing. And he became a significant and influential editor He considered himself, he and McGarvey were proclaimed moderates, whereas Franklin and Lipscomb and Fanning were conservative, and another fellow that we're going to talk about today, Isaac Errett, he was a progressive. So you didn't have just these extremes of conservative and liberal. You had some guys who sort of saw themselves in the middle. Well, anyway, so these guys and many others counseled non-participation. So what was happening, and John noted that in the South, the Christians petitioned President Davis to give them conscientious objector status, which he did. And that held for a while. In the North, things were a little different. But McGarvey wrote, "I would rather 10,000 times be killed for refusing to fight than to fall in battle or come home victorious with the blood of my brethren on my hands." McGarvey passionately and David Lipscomb passionately pleaded with Christians not to enlist and fight at the risk, for one thing, for killing other human beings, but especially for the potential of killing another Christian. Well, Lipscomb claimed that Tennessee Christians had been almost a unit in refusing military service, and I take issue with this. I don't find that would be an accurate statement at all, because even some of Fanning's students at Franklin College accepted officer commissions in the Confederate Army. So, however, he concluded that the Tennessee Christians withheld service. That's his opinion, and we'll just let that be, I guess. But thousands of Christians on both sides enlisted. Now, how did that come to be? In fact, Campbell's son wore Confederate gray, as did Barton W. Stone Jr. James A. Garfield, who became President of the United States, he became a colonel in the Union Army, actually made recruiting speeches on church steps and persuaded many of his former students at Hiram College to join his regiment. And even though these guys were pacifists, it doesn't mean that they didn't passionately support their region. Benjamin Franklin was an avowed loyalist to the Union. Lipscomb and Fanning were Southerners, absolute shills for the South, even though they did not advocate military service. Well, Benjamin Franklin, now he lived up in Indiana, kind of right around the Cincinnati area, Ohio, kind of that region. So he was a Northerner. This is what he looked like. And when he was criticized for not allowing political issues to be discussed in the American Christian Review, which was his journal, he protested that he had not one spark of disloyal feeling toward the Union, but loved it, next to the government of God. Well, Tolbert Fanning believed that the war had been caused by infidel preachers, and he named men such as Theodore Parker, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Henry Ward Beecher, who trampled underfoot the Word of God and the Constitution. And when asked if the South was justified in resisting the Union, he replied, "If people were ever justified in resisting encroachments, we conscientiously believe the citizens of the Confederate States are. But," he hastened to add, "all we have spoken as a citizen is as a citizen of the world and not as a member of the family of God." So these guys were not immune from feeling passionate about where they lived and the issues that affected their neighbors as well as themselves. Well, in 1861, now this is where things really started to get nasty in the church during the Civil War. In 1861, the American Missionary Society met in Cincinnati. No Southerners were present. And the question for the meeting was whether the society would take a political position on the war or just maintain its focus on missions. Now remember, I said the problem with these organizations is that they take on a life of their own. Now here is an organization that's mission, no pun intended, was missions, right? Its objective was missions. And here they are having to take a political side. What has that got to do with an organization that is founded to do mission work? Well, nevertheless, Dr. John Robeson of Bedford, Ohio, introduced a resolution calling on brethren everywhere to do all in their power to sustain the proper and constitutional authority of the Union. And then James A. Garfield, who showed up in uniform, made a speech favoring the resolution. So, and this is Garfield in his uniform. Well, the resolution passed in recess. So what happened was that they decided they were going to take a vote, but before they took the vote, they had a recess. And while they were recessed, they took the vote and had only one person object. So you say, well, what is that all about? Well, I think what that was all about is they called recess so that anybody who was not for this resolution could not be there to vote. That's the way, politics works, I guess. But at any rate, when the news of the Society's action reached Southern Christians, Tolbert Fanning, Humble says he was heartbroken and angered. He was livid. He was ticked because here, just 2 years prior to this, he had been at the society meeting and said, he objected to the society, but said, you know what, we're still one, we're still brothers. He wasn't going to condemn, his objective was unity. And here the society has taken a position condemning the South. Well, Fanning wrote in the Gospel Advocate that the Missionary Society had adopted resolutions approving the wholesale murder of the Southern people, and that the Missionary Society was encouraging thousands of professed servants of the Prince of Peace to enlist in the Union armies. Fanning bluntly and sadly wrote, "Can we fraternize with them," talking about society preachers, "as brethren? Unless there was thorough repentance on his part, he did not see how he could ever regard preachers who enforce political opinions by the sword in any other light than monsters in intention, if not in very deed." And he pleaded, how can Christian men of the South do otherwise? So this was creating some serious bitterness between the Northern Christians and the Southern Christians. Well, unfortunately, it got worse instead of better. And I put this up there. If you remember the Roadrunner and Coyote, the Coyote sort of couldn't get out of his own way. Everything he tried just made it worse, right? His efforts to catch the Roadrunner, he tried all these ingenious things, and it just made the problem worse. Well, that was really the society. They could not get out of their own way. In 1863, they met again and adopted an even stronger resolution supporting the North. Now, what happened was that militant abolitionists, and this is the way it always goes, isn't it? Small but vocal in number, had been demanding, now they had been doing this since 1851, they had been demanding that slavery be denounced as a sin and that Southern slave owners be disfellowshipped. Now, I'll pose a question to you. What is the problem? And this may be my opinion, but I could be a jerk and say it's my opinion, ought to be yours. But I'll say this, I'll just see how you feel about it. What is the problem with activists? particularly militant activists, as you see it?
They go too far on one side of the issue.
Okay, they go too far on one side of the issue. Yes.
Their own egos.
Their own egos. Yes. They can only see, they are myopic, right? They are myopic. The only thing that matters is their cause. But what is the real problem? The real problem is that you cannot be active enough. You cannot be passionate enough. You know, eventually, they're going to incriminate everybody. It's a monster that cannot be satisfied. Well, even Alexander Campbell wasn't spared. Campbell was against slavery, but he felt like the abolitionists were divisive, that they did more harm than good in the church because they offended. Well, that wasn't okay with the abolitionists, and so they branded him, a heretic, basically. They even went so far as to say, because you are not an abolitionist, we're going to establish another university other than Bethany. And so they established Northwestern Christian University in Indianapolis, which today is known as Butler University. Well, even the American Christian Missionary Society. So here where this whole thing started, well, they even weren't good enough. And so they started a rival missionary society. Well, then they started rumors circulating in the North that the American Christian Missionary Society was disloyal to the Union, which forced the society to adopt a new loyalty resolution which denounced these rumors as false and slanderous and declared its unqualified support of the North. So this is just making the problem worse among Christians in the South who felt totally shunned and unappreciated in the least. So this alienated even many of its former supporters in the North. J.W. McGarvey wrote that the society had destroyed its usefulness and should cease to exist. And Franklin, who had actually been a supporter initially, in his magazine wrote that the society has abandoned its legitimate work in adopting the resolution, and so after the war he became the society's most vigorous opponent in the North. And in 1866, immediately after the war, Fanning proposed a general consultation meeting of Southern Christians to assess the condition of the church in the South. So they had this meeting in Murfreesboro in June. They were just trying to figure out, okay, where do we go from here? Well, Franklin read about this meeting and was offended that no Northern Christians were invited, which, I don't know, just sort of smacks as hypocritical. I mean, given that they didn't invite the Southerners to come up north. But he said, there is no South or North in our gospel. So this bitterness just wouldn't go away. Well, Fanning told Franklin that he doubted the propriety of a hasty religious reconstruction with Northern brethren, since they had been employing the fist of wickedness against their brethren in the South. And Fanning added, it seems to me that men engaged in such service may not be very well prepared to engage in genuine spiritual cooperation. So his point was, we're not interested in reconciling with you because your attitudes have not been such, that your people who would seem to be interested in cooperating with us. Well, Lipscomb was even more bitter than Fanning. Writing in The Advocate, he recalled that he had expected the Cincinnati Society to strengthen those who were pleading with Christians not to enlist in the armies, but instead he wrote, "We found only vindictive, murderous spirit ruling its councils and encouraging the Christian work of Christians north, robbing and slaughtering Christians south." Now, Arrett, who is going to come up in a minute, he responded that Lipscomb basically was a sore loser. The only reason Lipscomb was saying this was because the South lost. So just get the feel of this bitterness. Hooper, Robert Hooper, I was reading in his book. He said the division would have come whether there had been a war or not. I don't know if that's true, but the war certainly was a nail in the coffin. Well, Franklin's articles in the American Christian Review had been effective in restraining Christians in the South from enlisting because it indicated that the Northern Christians were trying to stand aloof from military service and bloodshed. So what was going on? Franklin is up there in the North writing to primarily the Northern Christians, but Southern Christians as well. But his magazine, obviously during the war, would have done well in the North, pleading with Northern Christians not to enlist. Well, then the society goes and makes these resolutions which push the Southern Christians over the edge, and they went and enlisted. And, so Lipscomb really took offense that here, they're trying to hold back the tide of these people going to war, and all for naught. So Lipscomb concluded, we still feel that the society committed a great wrong against the church and the cause of God. We still feel that without evidence of a repentance of the wrong, it should not receive the confidence of the Christian brotherhood. The war had caused irreparable damage to the Restoration movement, but it was not the only cause. There had been a growing divide among churches in the North and the South in philosophy. Southern churches tended to be more conservative, more strict in their view of the Restoration's objective, whereas in the North they were much more progressive, which we're going to take a look at in just a minute. Well, the decade after the war, there was significant controversy within the movement, and it wasn't just the North versus the South. There was controversy going on within Christians in the North. And what was happening was that Franklin is up there kind of writing the conservative viewpoint, and the progressives took real offense at what he was writing. And so they decided, these 6 men decided to establish a new paper touting the progressive viewpoint. It was called the Christian Standard. It first appeared in April of 1866. And it was, you know how, I don't know if you were here last week, Neil talked about Firm Foundation being established to answer the Gospel Advocate. Well, the Christian Standard was established to answer the American Christian Review. The men who founded the Standard believed that Franklin was too narrow and dogmatic in his loyalty to the past. And so Isaac Arrett, who was one of the 6 founders, they chose him to be the editor. And this is Isaac Arrett here. And he was quite the standard bearer for progressives, not only in the North, but progressives, period. He had been raised in the Haldanian Church of Christ in New York, but he worked and preached mostly in Ohio. He served as co-editor of the Millennial Harbinger in 1861, and he was closely associated with Alexander Campbell during the last years of Campbell's life. Now, what was happening with Campbell as he aged, he seemed to have shifted to much more of an acceptance of progressivism, put it nicely, than he had been earlier. And we talked about that some in weeks past. This paper didn't do well from the start. They had expected it to be widely accepted. It was not. And financially, it was a disaster. The stockholders voted after just a couple of years to discontinue the paper, but instead, Eric said, I'll take it, and so they transferred ownership to him, and he was able to get the R.W. Carroll Company of Cincinnati to take control of it and put it on solid financial footing, and they kept Eric as the editor until his death. So this is going to perpetuate this controversy for years and years to come. Well, Eric and David Lipscomb squared off in their respective publications. So you got the Standard and you got the Gospel Advocate. But it wasn't so much over the society as it was about the right of Christians to engage in military service, who was responsible for the war, and the status of freedmen in the South. So they're going back and forth on these issues, and then he's going back and forth with Franklin on these others. So this is just constant controversy. So the real clash of ideas was in the North, where Franklin stood opposed on a wide variety of issues with Eric. First was over the Missionary Society, and later over instrumental music. Eric was the first preacher in the movement to accept the title Reverend, which just baffled Franklin. He couldn't believe any preacher in the Restoration movement would allow themselves to be called Reverend, but Eric did, and he described his critics as the loudest croakers against progression. Franklin said of Eric, "We are heartily sick of progressive Christians continually talking about a higher order of Christianity and keeping up with the time. These church progressionists progress so rapidly that they frequently transcend the limits of Christian duty." And he warned that they were more interested in conciliation and compromise than in converting the world. So basically what he's saying is that these progressives are interested in progressing, not interested in the work of the church, which oftentimes is true. I can remember my mother. When I was younger and knew everything, I'd get frustrated with the elders here, and I'd just be running off at the mouth, and my mother would look at me and she said, "Nelson, you've lost your focus." Well, that shut me up for a while. And, I think about that. When I think about these guys, I'm like, you've lost your focus. You've become much more interested in your cause, in your own ego, than you are in doing the work of the church, in glorifying God. So this really is becoming pitiful, really. Well, opposition to the society was becoming widespread. So those who favored the society attempted to win support of the opposition by making some changes to its constitution. Basically, they just did away with it and started over. The life memberships and life directorships, which were purchased by contribution, were abolished, and the structure was radically changed in 1869. New missionary boards were set up at the district, state, and national levels. Now, this was called the Louisville Plan because it was passed in Louisville, in a meeting in Louisville. So basically what they did was they said that the churches on the local level would send their contributions to the local board. The local board would send half of what it received to the state board, and then the state board would send half of what it received to the national board. Well, that's a great plan. We'll do it. Even Franklin and McGarvey jumped on. Oh, that's tremendous. Except McGarvey proposed an amendment which allowed each church to specify some other distribution of funds if they desired. In the end, the result of this amendment was that the national board didn't receive enough funding to carry on any mission work. So what happened was McGarvey said, look, rather than define how much they have to send to the national level, let the churches do that of their own volition. And Franklin would say, oh, this is tremendous. And so he supported it for some reason. You know, this was actually more of an ecclesiastical plan. And whether he saw that, was just tired of fighting, or whether for the sake of unity, I don't know. But he got on board with this. Well, by 1871, the national boards weren't getting any money. The local churches were like, you know, if it's our choice how much we're going to send, we're not going to send any. So Franklin concluded that the churches were saying they could spend their mission funds more efficiently than the national board. No kidding. Isn't that what God set up from the beginning? Here we are, we've come full circle back to the churches doing their own mission work. Well, this created some reconciliation and good feeling, but it was short-lived. One step forward, two steps back. Now we get to instrumental music. The instrument was not used, or its use even discussed, in the early days of the Restoration movement. The first discussion of the question came in 1851, when a reader asked J.B. Henschel, editor of the Ecclesiastical Reformer, whether instrumental music might not add solemnity to worship. And Henschel's answer was against it, but he later carried some articles by others favoring the instrument. Well, when he did this, that got the attention of John Rogers. So John Rogers asked Alexander Campbell what he thought. And his opinion was that if churches had no real devotion or spirituality in them, then the instrument might be an essential prerequisite to devotion, but to all spiritually minded Christians, such aids would be as a cowbell in a concert. Message being, if you need an instrument, you got a problem. Well, that was the end of that. It wasn't even brought up again for another 10 years. The first congregation to use instrumental music was the Midway, Kentucky Church. Now, Midway, Kentucky is up kind of in the Lexington area. And they had a liberal preacher named Dr. L.L. Pinkerton. And around 1860, they brought in a small melodeon. Now, I had to ask John what that was. And you can, I wish I had something to give you perspective, but this thing is really small. This is the actual instrument here. But it's a small organ is what it is. And so the reason for using it was the poor singing. Pinkerton said it was so bad that it would scare even the rats from worship. I guess that's his opinion. I don't know. I don't think God. I think God's tone deaf. But anyway, there was opposition to it. One of the elders, Adam Hibbler, and a slave removed the melodeon through a window. But eventually it was returned. Well, by 1864, 1865, the question began to get extended discussion. W.K. Pendleton, who was editor of the Millennial Harbinger after Campbell, conceded that instrumental music was not used in the early church, but to him it was a question of mere expediency. Now, this is an interesting, if you look up the definition of expediency, you kind of wonder why they would use that term. Anybody know what expediency means?
Easy to get the job done.
What's that? Easy to get the job done. Okay, if you look up the definition, that's pretty close to the definition. Meaning, even if it's wrong, we do it because it's convenient. So I'm thinking, oh man, why would you describe anything you would do in the church as expedient? Well, it has a little different meaning in this context. Church buildings are expedient. So why would that be? Why would you call a church building expedient? Huh? We could do without it, but it is, sure, we could meet in houses. I guess we could meet at a shopping mall, you know, whatever, right? But I mean, to me, a better term is pragmatic, right? Tuning forks and pitch pipes are expedient, okay? They're not necessary, but they are helpful. So that's the way they described this. Well, there's the first bell. I got to get moving. So McGarvey took exception to this. He wrote, in the early years of the present Reformation, there was entire unanimity in the rejection of instrumental music from our public worship. It was declared unscriptural, inharmonious with the Christian institution, and a source of corruption. Well, he went on like that for 20 years, but eventually he just gave up talking about it because churches in Kentucky and the North were just determined to use it, but he opposed it all of his life. Moses Lard was another unyielding opponent of the instrument. He believed these organ grinding churches will be, in the lapse of time, broken down or wholly apostatized, meaning that they'll come to their senses and let it go. And the sooner they are in fragments, the better for the cause of Christ. It was usually the larger urban churches that the organ first appeared. Maybe that was because they could afford it, more so than the poorer rural churches. One rather comical incident happened in St. Louis regarding the introduction of an organ. The church had bought an Episcopalian church building in 1867 that had an organ in it. Well, the church opposed its use, and so the pro-organ members withdrew in disgust and built the Central Christian Church, which had no organ. So the anti-organ church had an instrument and wouldn't use it, and the pro-organ church had no organ. Anyway, Arrett and Franklin found themselves in another bitter dispute. Arrett's view was that the instrument shouldn't be introduced, not because of any conscientious scruples against the use of instruments, but rather based on the law of love. Since many Christians opposed its use, it was better to preserve the unity of the church. Writing, better is poor singing where love is than the grandest tones of the organ and hatred therewith. Now, I would love to know the tone of voice in which he wrote that, because that could mean several different things. But since we don't know, we'll move on. So Franklin had a real problem with that attitude because he said if the only reason we're not doing it is because, this promotion of unity, that sort of leaves the door open for if people change their mind, we could use it. But this is wrong. And so he said, we put it on no ground of opinion or expediency. The acts of worship are all prescribed in the law of God. He called the organ the accompaniment of lifeless, formal, and fashionable churches in cities where pride, aristocracy, and selfishness prevail, where the poor have no sympathy, comfort, or place. Now, Lipscomb didn't have a whole lot to say about it because it wasn't an issue in the South, but he did chide the inconsistency of men such as McGarvey and Lard for opposing the organ but supporting missionary society. Now, another thing I read, Hooper wrote that, it might have been that Lipscomb didn't have a whole lot to say about it because he was tone deaf, and it wouldn't have mattered to him. He couldn't have heard it anyway. I don't know. So anyway, that's where I want to stop today, because that really that brings us into the late 1800s, which really effectively the division has happened. It hasn't been officially recognized, but what I want to get into in a couple of weeks is Lipscomb's writing about the necessity of the division, which is really a sad reality. And I tell you what, I'm a little bit worried that we're not going down the same road. We don't have the bitterness that we had back then, but a lot of these same issues are just cropping up again. And so I think it's a good idea that we go back and look at what happened to keep it from happening again. Any questions, comments, Judy?
I want to talk about that word progressive.
Yeah, the word progressive.
What exactly
Yeah, the issues of the progressives, other than the Missionary Society and the Instrument, role of women in the church was another. Just the. I mean, for everything we think is a new problem, we've got churches here in this community now going to appoint women elders. This is nothing new. This is nothing new. These issues have been going on for hundreds of years. I can't think of another issue other than women's role. I know there are some, I just can't think of it off the top of my head.
Not current now, but Sunday school was a big issue.
Sunday school, yeah.
And cooperation with orphans' homes and Christian colleges.
Orphans' homes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And another thing we're going to look at in a couple of weeks was that there's the Central, I believe it was the Central Church in Cincinnati. They built this huge building. Which was a real source of aggravation. It was kind of people who took exception to that as being showy, and they brought in denominational preachers to open the church. So it's I mean, just one controversial issue after another. Anybody else?
We just keep beating the dead horse.
Keep beating the dead horse? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we kind of like the coyote, we just seem to, stay in our own way and make the problem worse. Okay, we're dismissed. Thank you.